Hi, my name is Söring, and I spent 33 years in prison for a crime I didn't commit. In 2023, Netflix released a four-part series about my case, which, in my opinion, did not tell the whole truth. So I'm making a whole series of videos with law enforcement officers and others involved in the case to bring that truth to light. One of the things completely left out of the Netflix series is the existence of an FBI crime scene profile by one of the first profilers to work in that field, Ed Sulzbach. And I'm privileged to have with me here today a retired FBI special agent who in 2018 brought to light the original FBI file on the crime for which I was wrongfully convicted, the Hasten double murders. And back in 2018, FBI Special Agent Stan Lapekas spent months working on this together with other officers like Chip Harding, Richard Hudson, and Chuck Reed. But I've never actually had a chance to speak with him in person or by video. So this is a first for me, and I'm really happy to have you here today, Stan. Please say hello to our viewers and tell us a little bit about who you are and how you got into law enforcement.
Well, good morning. I got to think back on that, how I got involved. Actually, after I got out of the military, I went back to college, and from college, I entered the FBI, and I spent about close to 27 years with the FBI. And then after I retired, I went to work for the Commonwealth of Virginia in a investigative regulatory agency. And actually, at one point, I became the executive secretary. And I was there for about 5 years. And then following that, I was hired as an in-house investigator for a major law firm in Richmond, Virginia. So all total, I probably spent approximately 50 years as an investigator. There was a FBI profile done at the crime scene in your case, and no one has been able to find it. I said, well, let me work on that. Let me see what I can do. So the first thing I did on your case, I became aware of the fact that the prosecutor, Jim Updike, had written a letter to another attorney in Lynchburg where he attached a rough draft, and I guess they refer to them as field notes, where it specifically mentioned Ed Sulzbach and his results of the profile he undertook. He sent that with a letter with his signature to another attorney. Then it came up repeatedly that there was no profile done. Well, I said, well, that's ridiculous. I mean, here you have the prosecuting attorney sending a rough draft of the results of the profile to another attorney. So how can you say that? But I just kind of let that slide. And then I saw the interview of Ed Sulzbach before he passed away, where he said that he did a profile at the request of the sheriff's department.
I got a phone call from the sheriff in Bedford County. And the different sheriffs and chiefs around the state of Virginia knew me and knew that I was a profiler. And I drove out to Bedford County. My mission was to study the crime and come up with possible suspects. And Mrs. Haysom was wearing her nightgown with a robe. And it occurred to me that Mrs. Haysom would never entertain strangers in such attire. Who might be close enough to her that she would feel comfortable entertaining in a nightgown and robe. We're dealing with somebody's close to these people. And that I suggested to the investigators.
Settled on her daughter because Mrs. Haysom was a very proper woman. And I came to the conclusion pretty quickly that it was someone they knew very well.
Did you all do any paperwork on that? You and another agent did a psychological profile for us.
Yeah, I remember that well.
So I kept on digging, and I finally was able to determine a file number. The file number that was given to your case by the FBI is called the Domestic Police Cooperation File. It's somebody calls a local police department or whatever, and they need help, and we decide to help them. We'll open a case in that regard to send out leads and get paperwork and so forth. So when I came up with the file number, I put another Freedom of Information request in, and then I received all the documents that you're well aware of. And then in that, there was a teletype which noted that the fact that the FBI Quantico had conducted a profile. I think if I remember correctly, it mentioned that it was possibly a female, somebody who could get easy access to the house. In other words, not an uninvited visitor. And then I saw the interview of Ricky Gardner, where he was adamant that there wasn't a profile done. After all these years, by the way, I think he made a comment that if there was a profile done, he would have known about it because he knows everything about the case. Well, when people over the years have been asking about the profile, you would think that giving him a little leeway here, that he would reach out for Updike, who now became a judge, and ask him, say, hey, was there a profile? Of course, that was never done that I know of. So what do you make of that? You know, you got to say, why is this all happening? Why is there such a denial about the profile?
And now for a brief commercial interruption. I've fought for justice for 33 years while I was in prison, and I'm still fighting for justice today after my release, through these videos and through a new pardon petition. There's a method to my madness. In prison, I developed a 7-step program for developing fighting spirit so that I would never, ever, ever give up. Today, I work as a coach, and I teach my clients how to develop that fighting spirit as well. Most of my clients come to me because of issues like career development, toxic relationships, libel, or defamation. But of course, I adapt my program to whatever my clients' needs are. If you're interested in working with me as a coach, please go to my website. I'll check you out there.
So you got to go back to the beginning of the prosecution after you and Elizabeth were arrested, and she eventually comes back and you stay over there in Europe and hang over there for a while. There was a decision made, and I truly believe this happened, knowing how things work in the justice system, that somebody made the decision going forward that they were going to use you as the actual physical person at the crime scene and use Elizabeth to testify against you. And to do that, they decided, and it was probably Jim Updike, because he's the coach and he's the guy that has to get the case together, that this is what they were going to do, that they were going to deny the existence of a profile going forward at the trial. There's a good chance that at least, and I can't prove this, but Ricky Gardner had to be made aware of that they were going to let the profile die on the vine, so to speak. And they were going to use Elizabeth to testify against you. You have to look at that and say, well, why would they do that? In other words, hide the profile going forward. And I've said this before, there's an old saying about the first one under the tree gets all the shade. And they decided, in my opinion, to give Elizabeth the shade. And probably the reason, one of the reasons behind that was the fact that they determined that both of you were involved in the case in varying degrees, before or after the fact, or, you know, the actual commission of the murder, whatever. And so it really didn't make any difference to them that they could use Elizabeth to testify against you as the actual killer. Because apparently, I guess they figured justice will be served. Let me back up a little bit on how some of this stuff works. The sheriff's department in this case is a relatively small sheriff's department in the scheme of things, as opposed to a metropolitan city or a big county like in Los Angeles or whatever, where they have a lot of crime, all kinds of violent crime. And when it happens in a county like Bedford County, I mean, it just shakes the community. I mean, people are just beside themselves. And to include the people in law enforcement that work there. And they're almost in a panic mode, rightfully so, to try to find out what happened, who did it, and so forth. And there's just a lot of pressure on these people. The pressure is not just the pressure to solve a terrible crime. There's political pressure too. There's the sheriff is elected, the prosecutor is, I believe, is elected, and so that's on their mind during this whole process. And after a trial, like in your case, when the dust settles, as they say, and people move on and time passes, it becomes even more important to not deviate or even acknowledge the existence of possible bad evidence or misinformation or whatever. Simply being because their careers have moved on. The prosecutor, Jim Updike, he eventually became a judge, right? Ricky Gardner, I think he moved up to be number 2. So that being the case, when somebody like Chip Harding or Stan knocks on their door and says, hey, can I ask you about this whole case? They really get uptight. I mean, they go, whoa, let's hold the show here. You're questioning our integrity now, our whatever. And one of the responses you get in a case like yours is that a common response from people that involved in this is, well, if there's something wrong with the case, the person can always appeal it. But as you're well aware, you can file an appeal on an issue in a case, whether it's blood or, in your case, the footprints or whatever, and the court might agree with you. But that's not enough to dismiss the case or vindicate you. I mean, it's just a long, hard process that, as they say, it's easier to get in than get out of jail. I mean, it's for sure. Anyway, the profile, in my opinion, there was a prosecutive decision made that they were going to bury the profile existence at all because they didn't want to muddy the waters in a trial. They just didn't want it there. Now, there's always been the opinion that, well, it's exculpatory evidence that they were hiding or whatever. I'm not too sure it would be exculpatory because the profile is basically an opinion. But still, it would have been nice to know that one was done.
I can briefly interject here that there is a precedent case called Brady versus Maryland, which requires the prosecutor to turn over exculpatory evidence and information.
Right.
Okay. A profile is not evidence because it's not admissible in court. Like you said, it's an opinion, but it is exculpatory information. And under
Right.
Brady versus Maryland, they had to turn that over. And there is a scene in a documentary film from 2016 called Killing for Love, which is no longer available, but which I can show here, where Ricky Gardner calls Chuck Reed, the original lead investigator, and asks him to say, Chuck, there never was a profile. If there had been a profile, that would have been exculpatory evidence.
Hello?
Hi, man.
Ricky, how you doing?
Chuck, they're coming back now. Chuck, we never did an FBI profile.
Yeah, we did.
No, we didn't.
It was Ed Solzback and another special agent. See, that's how I got to know Ed.
Chuck Reed absolutely misspoke when he said there was ever any profile done on this case. It was never a profile done on this case. Now, I don't know how nobody ever wrote anything down.
Chuck, if we had done one of those, that would have been exculpatory evidence.
To be honest with you, I have a copy of some old field reports and stuff.
But obviously there was nothing mentioned in
The profile?
To be a profile done.
Yeah, it's in there. It's stating that Special Agent Ed Solzback did this, the psychological profile and came back to a female acquaintance and not. There's 4 or 5 different things that's in there.
So you think they have filled one out?
Yeah, I know they have. They had talked to Ed, and Ed had said, well, one thing about it, said FBI don't lose anything. And Ed's pretty adamant about the fact of them doing it. Again, I look at it like it's no skin off my nose or your nose. It's one of those things, gosh, if it did, it did. If it, that's...
The FBI never throws anything away.
Yeah, I remember reading that he said that. I'm getting off track here, but I feel terrible for Chuck Reed. They basically tarnished him. I mean, he was being truthful. He knew that there was a profile had been done to basically call him a liar. And it's just terrible. Let me touch on the denial of the profile a little bit more. Ricky Gardner, and this also piqued my interest. Ricky Gardner was interviewed and made a comment about the profile and the fact that you would have to be well educated to fill out the form to have a profile done. Now, I found that interesting where he came up with that at this point in time, because in one sense, that is somewhat true. If you have a case where it's like a serial killer case, where it's been ongoing and so forth, normally you would fill out a pretty long questionnaire, so to speak, about all the evidence you've gathered, and can the FBI do a profile on that? And you send that in, and they'll do that and they'll send it back, the results. But in your case, and this happens quite a bit, where you have a crime where the community goes crazy, and like I mentioned, a lot of pressure on your case, the sheriff's department and so forth, to solve it, where they'll make a call, which is what happened here, and say, hey, we need help now, immediately, to the point where the sheriff Wood at the time is quoted in the newspaper as requesting a profile. And obviously, by the results of the file that I was able to locate, that was done immediately. And what happened is that Salzbeck, who is a trained profiler, and he works probably hand in hand at times with the actual agents in Quantico in the profile unit to do this, actually went to the crime scene, okay, and did what he's trained to do and turned the results over to them. And like I said, and not to be repetitive, when Salzbeck did that, he generated paperwork which I was unable to find. The FBI doesn't lose anything. Let me put it that way. It doesn't happen, okay? There has to be something in that file from Ed Salzbeck, period.
If I understand you correctly, you're suggesting that the file was cleaned out.
I don't have any proof positive to say that, okay? But knowing how the system works, having been in the FBI as long as I was, knowing how the requirements for papering a file and putting information in, it just doesn't set right with me. It just, something happened. And I don't know what exactly, but let me.
I want to interrupt, and I want to say, of course, I understand this is difficult, right? And I want to thank you for going as far as you did. I want to point out that there is at least one other document in this case that apparently disappeared. It's a forensic report relating to a hair that was found in the blood-stained bathroom sink at the crime scene. Right? That hair was compared to both of the victims, and it did not belong to the victims, and it was compared to me, and it did not belong to me. But it's in the blood-stained sink, which suggests very strongly that that was left by one of the killers. And we don't know whose hair that is. And the prosecution claimed that this hair was never compared to Elizabeth. And there is no forensic report comparing it to Elizabeth, right?
Right.
And, you know, I'll go to my grave believing that, in fact, of course, that hair was compared to Elizabeth. It would have been extremely sloppy police work not to compare it to Elizabeth. But that forensic report is gone. Do you want to offer some opinion on that? If you have had a case like that and you had a hair in a bloody sink and it's not the victims and it's not the main accused, wouldn't you want to find out whose hair that is?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if I was involved as an investigator in your original case with the sheriff's department, let's say I work for the sheriff's department, and I had some type of authority to have certain things done or make sure things were done, I obviously would have checked the hair. Okay. There's other things I would have done too. I don't want to get off track here, but I don't know if there was a real good look at inventory of clothing in the house. Was there anything that was missing clothing wise that may have been used to wear out, somebody wore when they left? footwear, socks, and so forth, take something with them. Again, I don't want to beat it to death, but I think at the time, the prosecutor felt very comfortable doing what they did because there's probably a feeling that justice is being served, okay? Unfortunately, they decided to use you as the actual killer, okay? The one that committed the crime at the house. I don't think they ever thought, when I say them, I'm talking about Ricky Gardner and maybe the prosecutor, that this would ever come back to haunt them. I'm sure they didn't. But everything that's happened since then that has caused them probably a little bit of heartburn, they created it themselves. No one else did it. They're the ones that have denied the existence of a profile. Why would you do that? It doesn't make any sense at all. Because if they had admitted it in the beginning, all they would have to say, if they could, would be, yeah, there was a profile conducted. However, based upon additional investigation, we were able to determine that it wasn't a female, it wasn't somebody close to the family. This is how we did it. We determined it, whether it be through evidence, physical evidence, forensic evidence, whatever. Their whole case was based upon typo blood, a footprint that has proven to be just crazy, it's just junk science, and a false confession. But anyway, to tie up the profile, there was obviously a concerted effort that was made by the prosecution to say this profile never happened, because you just would not deny it when it's so obvious that it did happen. So it defies anything you try to analyze and put together and say, well, this is the reason they forgot. I mean, you can't forget. This is a big, big case.
So just to sum this up, because this has been challenged continually, not just by Ricky Gardner, but also by some people here in Germany. There's no question in your mind at all that there was a profile performed, that it should have been in the file, but it is now, and that there was a decision made by the prosecution and the sheriff's department to bury this thing because it didn't match the official version of what happened that night.
Correct. You have to say to yourself, why would they continue for years, like 35 years, whatever, 30-some years, to deny that? So they kind of got, in my opinion, got in a trick bag, as they say, where we've denied it for so long, we can't admit it now. It make us look like a bunch of fools. You know, again, from day one, literally day one, the prosecutor was well aware that Ed Salzbeck did a profile. That's obvious because he used that rough draft field note thing outlining the results of Salzbeck and mentioned his name and sent it to another attorney. But like I said, it went on for too long. They couldn't change the story, and they'll never change the story.
Well, I think that's a really good place to end this first part of our interview. And I want to thank you very much, Stan.